Hello, everyone. Today we will be hearing about the experience of Dr. Rachel Talley as a psychiatrist for children and professor of psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. We will learn more about how we can support our Black children with mental health issues and understand the areas of education that we are lacking for our providers. Thank you for joining us today. Our speaker is Dr. Rachel Talley, MD. Dr. Talley is an assistant professor of clinical psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. She directs the University of Pennsylvania's Fellowship in Community Psychiatry, a post-residency training program that teaches administrative and leadership skills to grow the next generation of public sector psychiatric leadership. She has several years of frontline clinical experience in community-based settings and is currently staff attending at Horizon House Incorporated, where she sees patients in outpatient, integrated care, intensive case management, and homeless service settings, and is also involved administratively in quality improvement activities. Dr. Talley received her BA from Harvard University and her MD from Stanford University School of Medicine. She completed both her residency training in adult psychiatry and a post-residency fellowship in public psychiatry at Columbia University in New York State Psychiatric Institute. She currently serves on the board of the American Association for Community Psychiatry as early career psychiatrist representative. If you have any questions for Dr. Talley, please put them in the Q&A section of our Zoom. If you run your mouse along the bottom of the screen, you will see where it says Q&A, so you can put your questions in there. And I will turn it over to Dr. Talley.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. And I want to thank you, Jamal and Nancy, for the honor of being able to present to this gathering. One sort of disclaimer I will put out there is that I know that I believe there is a focus in this series on children and families. I myself am an adult psychiatrist, but I'm hoping that some of the themes that I share will certainly have relevance for children and families. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen. Right. Hopefully be able to make my way to start to launch the PowerPoint. Just a moment here. Apologies, a little bit of difficulty with this sort of the panel we talked about, kind of covering up the ability to start the show. Give me just a moment.
Nancy's going to have a word with Zoom about that.
I know. All right, here we go. All right, you see that my tech prowess is not what I was invited to this gathering for. So what I'm going to be presenting on today, this is structural racism and psychiatric practice. And basically what I'm hoping to present here is a little bit of content from an article that I was pleased to publish with a group called the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry, and just sharing some reflections and ideas on this interface of racism and psychiatric work. And just, I would say, in a sense, a little bit of my personal journey to this moment and ideas that I came up with this group of colleagues in terms of thinking about how to meet this moment as a psychiatric provider. So just to start out, a few sort of disclosures and acknowledgements. As far as disclosures, first, just referencing back from my bio, I am on the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania, and I work clinically at Horizon House, but I am here as my individual self, not necessarily expressing the views of either of those institutions. I am a senior medical advisor with a for-profit venture called Vana Health, but none of the content in this presentation is related to that work. And then I want to start off with a big acknowledgement that, again, what this presentation will consist of is content from an article that I had the pleasure of publishing with the Psychopathology Committee of the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry. And for those who aren't familiar, the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry, which is an organization that has been around since 1946 and is essentially a think tank of top psychiatric minds whose thoughtful analysis and recommendations serve to influence and advance modern psychiatric theory and practice, as described on the group's website. And so I've posted up here basically sort of the byline from that article, in part because I want to acknowledge at the beginning that while I was pleased to sort of be the lead on this publication on this topic, that this was a group effort in terms of pulling together this thinking that I'm going to share. And so I acknowledge my co-authors who are listed here on the slide. And so to begin, so I'm going to begin what I would say is almost my big sort of personal disclosure, and I wanted to start out with a little bit of humor. I'm hoping that folks are on the call, some at least, are familiar with the person I have here up on the screen. For those who are not big TV watchers necessarily, this is a character from the television show The Office, which was one of my sort of binging TV watching projects during the start of the COVID pandemic. This is a character named Stanley. And so I'll tell a little bit about why I sort of post him up here in a way to sort of reference my journey in this work, and sort of the caveat that I put out in the beginning of a presentation like this is that for me, I will say, even at this point, it is still very odd in a way to be asked to come to present as an expert, if you will, on these issues of racism and their interface with mental health, because in all transparency, and I will say this is not false modesty in any way, I cannot claim to be an expert on those issues. In terms of my scholarly work prior to 2020, I've had an interest in work with populations with serious mental illness, integrated care, basically had published some scholarly work related to that. As Jamal mentioned, direct a fellowship in community psychiatry, have had a real interest in sort of bringing talented psychiatrists into the public psychiatry workforce. And so that's really had been the main thrust of my career, and continues to be. And yet then 2020 happened, right? So 2020 came around, and there was this really sort of this revitalized national dialogue around the issue of structural and systemic racism, issues that are in a way old as time, and yet for the past couple of years have had this renewed national focus. And part of why I put Stanley from The Office up here on the screen is that for those who aren't familiar with the show, The Office is a satirical show, basically, doing a bit of a send up of sort of the common office politics and sort of the humdrum, I guess, inanity of an office setting. Stanley's character is often used, I think, to sort of highlight to great satirical effect the experience of sort of the minority token in the office, and kind of being put on the spot as the person who represents certain issues, who is able to speak to certain issues. And so I put him up here because I will be honest that in 2020, still in certain ways, when I'm asked to speak on this topic, I will sometimes feel a little bit like that. I know some of my colleagues my colleagues of color, who I have talked with about this experience over the past couple of years. Many of us had this experience in 2020 of all of a sudden this issue of structural racism was to the forefront, and that for some of our colleagues of the non-minority background, the first reaction was okay, where do we find an expert who knows about this? Oh, there goes my colleague of color. They must know. They must be an expert on this issue. And so I found it's been a weird space to be in for the past couple of years, because I have felt very torn at times between the feeling of the deep personal resonance of these issues for me, that I think they're terribly important to speak on and discuss, and yet still feeling that I, like many, am still learning as far as structural racism in general, particularly its interface with mental health services and psychiatric care. And so I put this caveat out there to say that my presentation today is certainly not about my drawing on a vast, lengthy career of expertise on these issues, but more to share my journey over the past couple of years of starting to sort of build my knowledge around these issues. And I'll say that the group that published this article that I'll be walking through with me shared this sort of experience of our collective stumbling of that all of a sudden these issues are on the forefront. What do they mean for mental health practice? This is coming up in our day-to-day work left and right. Are we ready to meet this moment? And the fact that we do not feel ready, what does that say for what psychiatry as an institution needs to do to ensure that mental health practitioners are ready to address these important issues. So to start out, and here I have some examples that were drawn from our committee who wrote this article as far as how racial identity and racism was cropping up in our own backyard. That as this national dialogue started in 2020, myself and my colleagues found ourselves sort of grappling with the fact that, again, these issues of race, of racism have been in existence really forever. Certainly have been in existence within the mental health field forever. And we found there was we were feeling a new sense of attention and notice and sensitivity to these things coming up, in part because of the intense charged moment that was occurring in 2020, and found ourselves grappling as frontline clinicians, as educators. I'm in a teaching role at the University of Pennsylvania with what do we do to sort of meet this moment? So here on the screen, I just have a couple of, of course, de-identified generalized anecdotes that our group drew from our own experiences in teaching and in practice that sort of highlight where we found ourselves grappling with this interface, that whether we had worked with it or acknowledged it or not, race, racial identity, and racism was in the room as we were teaching and providing services. Had always been, really, but we found this new sense of attention of what are we doing about this? What is there to do about this? And has our training really brought us to a place where we have the experiences to meet this moment? So example of a supervisee, working and teaching, bringing up experiences of microaggressions and asking their supervisor, what do I do about this? Do I have to keep working with this person? How do I respond to a patient that I'm trying to provide service to who is hurting me? Experiences of patients asking that they not have to work with a provider of a particular racial identity. What do we do, sort of balancing the fact that we are in a serving profession and have a service mission with the fact that we also are individuals and people who hurt, who can experience the pain of being discriminated against? What do we do when our patients are discriminating against us? And so these are some of the questions that arose that we found ourselves pondering. And so I share these as just a few of the many ways in which the issue of race, the issue of racism is absolutely in the room, I'd say almost in any institution and setting, but certainly in mental health care, in mental health teaching, as well as mental health treatment. So with that in mind, our group, again, I was part of this group discussion, pondering these issues and thinking about the what to do next. And our next thought was to think through, well, what in our traditional mental health training, and this is myself and a group of psychiatrists thinking about this, what in our training, if anything, has prepared us to deal with these sticky, sensitive issues? And so our first thought was that, well, it's not that we have nothing necessarily, right? That as folks in, again, I'm speaking of psychiatrists, I think we could say this, certainly anybody who works in the mental health field, that there's some element of sort of tools that we sort of skills that we learn just as part of being a mental health practitioner that can help a little bit as far as addressing these moments. Just share examples. We have experiences of working through, helping individuals in psychological distress. And so we certainly have that experience with sticky, thorny, sensitive, very personal issues and having a comfort with trying to dive into them. Key parts of mental health practice can be thinking about things like transference and countertransference. How is the patient affecting you? How are you affecting the patient? That in that neutral sense, thinking about those issues is part of psychiatric training. And so one could argue that race is part of what we see when we walk into a room and we see a patient sees us. And so to the extent that part of our training is explicitly grappling with this discussion of what are the negative or positive feelings that this patient has about me coming into the room? What are the negative or positive feelings stirring up in me as I interface with this patient? That we thought, well, that could be a starting place too for thinking about some of these difficult things. Thinking that, of course, a key foundational part of mental health work is thinking about how do we foster a therapeutic alliance? How do we build that bridge where a person who walks in not knowing us from anybody feels that sense of comfort, where they can disclose their deepest and most personal thoughts, feelings, fears, and hopes, and that a key part of a training is thinking about how do we understand the perspective of another. And so similarly, our group thought, well, again, these tools feel like things that could certainly be applied to some of these difficult, stressful, thorny issues. of racial identity and racism as it comes up in mental health practice. And yeah, it's our group certainly felt that for all whatever fancy training any of us might have, that there was a reason that we were having this discussion, that that it's like this is not easy to grapple with in care and in teaching. I will say as a supervisor, so outside of my clinical work, my main work is in teaching and supervision of folks who are in psychiatric training. I found myself coming up stumbling when my trainees would raise these difficult issues of, when I'm trying to do my patient case formulation, how do I think about race and racism? Where's the textbook? Where's the evidence-based practice? Where's the set of skills that I should be drawing on? And there were many times when questions like this came up, I found myself drawing a blank. Here I am, the educator. Here I am, an educator of color who certainly has personal experience with these issues. And yet this was not explicitly addressed to a great extent in my training. And I think that many, I don't want to speak broadly, of course, that a training program is different, but I would say that this is not an uncommon thing, I think, for psychiatric training. If this has not been an explicit part of sort of the foundational parts of our teaching of what it means to be a mental health practitioner. And so our group found ourselves grappling for, so what is the what next of how do we think about how to deal with these issues? And so this was the question: Are those tools sufficient? And I will humbly say, and I will say with due respect to the wonderful training that I feel privileged to have had prior to coming into my work in practice and in teaching, that I personally just did not feel that I had what I needed always to meet this moment in terms of doing this work. Sort of adding, I'd say, to the urgency of thinking about this is that while 2020, of course, since 2020, there's been this renewed focus around what is structural and systemic racism? Where does it manifest in our society? How is that different from interpersonal racism and other forms? While I think this important conversation has happened over the past couple of years, again, as I imagine many of us know on the call, this racism certainly is not a new thing, right? And in terms of mental health practice, while our group was kind of newly grappling with these ideas and these concepts, certainly racism and disparities by race are sadly as old as psychiatric practice itself. That psychiatry and mental health care, like any other field, is certainly not immune from the perniciousness of inequities and disparities. And so here I just have a few select examples of arenas in which we can see, if you look in the research literature, I imagine many have experienced even anecdotally in clinical practice, where inequity rears its head, that for a range of sort of treatment issues, whether it's simply access to mental health care, Black and brown individuals disproportionately lack access and aren't retained for as long a length of time in care. There's long-standing literature showing that for many life-saving evidence-based treatment, think about, I work in the serious mental illness space, a medication like clozapine, a life-saving treatment for treatment refractory schizophrenia. Long-standing evidence showing that this is underutilized in Black and brown populations. Diagnostic disparities. There's long-standing literature showing that psychotic disorders are overdiagnosed and misdiagnosed in Black and brown individuals. So again, the list goes on and on and on. And so I share these examples to say that the part of what brought an urgency to this moment is, again, that mental health care and services is not immune from these issues and is rife with disparity and inequity issues. And importantly, structural and systemic issues, right? That these issues, I would say that while I think the key root cause of many of them is not well understood, that this isn't necessarily about a clinician who is not of color, a white clinician looking across the room at, looking across the exam table at the Black patient and saying, well, because this person is a person of color, I'm not going to offer this treatment. I'm not going to do this. It's more that structural piece, right? That something about the way in which our systems of care are built has resulted in patients of a certain background disproportionately lacking certain services or not receiving services in the best way. And so I highlight these examples just to highlight the urgency of these issues for psychiatric practice, and part of as our group came together to think about and write this article, where we saw that urgency of this is pressing, this is life and death for some of our patients, and so we really need to be serious in thinking about how to both understand, teach about these issues, and ideally start to sort of have a system that really thinks in a sustained way about changing these issues. So given this, this was, this lengthy sort of discussion and reflection amongst this group that I have the pleasure of being a part of. And so we found ourselves thinking, okay, we see we're in this space and in this moment, trying to do our jobs, trying to take care of our patients, trying to teach the folks who are coming after us. We've sort of brought to the fore this feeling that we don't quite have what we need to meet this moment, that we know that there is the pressing urgency of these longstanding disparity and equity issues. And so we were left with so what next? How do we inform ourselves? How do we deliver care better? Is there anything out there that could inform how to work in this interface of race, racism, and mental health? How to think about, as we're doing our case formulations in terms of thinking about the patients that we serve and thinking about how to understand them and serve them best, how do we sort of have our systematic way of considering race and racism? How do we talk about race and racism in our supervision of the students and trainees who are coming up after us? How do we think about addressing microaggressions in the clinical encounter? Is there anything out there? We found ourselves pondering. And so what I have found, and again, I'll throw out that caveat to the group that I am by no means an expert. This is just sort of my personal sort of readings and looking into this, in part from necessity, as the patients I serve, as these discussions have come up, as the students that I work with have asked these questions, I as a teacher and then left in the position of needing to find ways to answer them. So I turn to colleagues, turn to the library, turn to the research literature, looking for what if anything is available. And I think importantly, we found, and again, noting that I'm not an expert, my guess, my assumption, my sense very strongly is that what I'm sharing here really just scratches the surface of what's out there. That these issues, that there are certainly plenty of people who have been thinking about and writing about and considering this interface. And so what our group found on this journey is that there certainly is not necessarily a lack of resources in terms of addressing these issues. This up here, I have a list of just sort of a grab bag sample of books that cover some of these issues around the history of racism in psychiatry and how to think about interventions to address racism as it interfaces with psychiatry. Books around eliminating race-based disparities, that we found that there's extensive writing on this topic. Similarly, we found there's some excellent concrete tools to address, issues of thinking about identity, thinking about privilege, thinking about our position in the world. Here I'm citing a particular exercise published in 2017, the Privilege and Responsibility Curricular Exercise, which is basically an exercise piloted in the Henry Ford Health System that essentially walked employees through thinking through a set of statements that highlight certain levels of privilege along different axes of identities, encouraging employees to sort of check off each option and then come together in breakout groups to discuss it. I put this out there as an example, is there is not a nothing there as far as thinking about privilege as a healthcare worker in a healthcare setting. Resources do exist. Here I just have an example of some of the questions and statements from that tool that are used to sort of guide employees in considering both the different elements of their identity and the privileges that may be embedded in that identity. Another example, this is a snapshot from a 2019 article that basically walks through some suggested language and sort of a concrete 3-step process for thinking about, as a clinical supervisor in a healthcare setting, how to deal with a microaggression when a patient says something that either intentionally or as microaggressions are, of course, unintentionally offends or hurts a member of the healthcare team based on identity. This is an excellent article that I've used a couple of times in my own teaching and practice, as far as giving some suggested language and suggested approaches for how to think about how to think about and react to how such incidents occurred. Basically walks the reader through both setting the stage as an educator in terms of preparing a team for the possibility that this could happen. Up here on this slide, ways to respond in that moment. And then perhaps most importantly, a debrief after in terms of discussing with the team what has occurred and how it was approached. So again, I put this wonderful previously published work out there as examples of that our group found upon a little bit of exploration that the resources exist, that it's not that there is nothing there, that there are things that can help us. To cite a few examples that I don't have here in the slides, one of my clinical roles is that I supervise psychotherapy. So meaning I work with residents who are developing their first skills in terms of the practice and provision of psychotherapy. And so there's an excellent article by Dr. Shen and Greenlee out there about talking about race and racism in psychotherapy supervision. So very specific, tackling exactly this issue that I have used numerous times and gone back to and referenced numerous times in terms of thinking about what are some guiding tools I can use to approach this discussion. And so putting that all together, so the journey I've sort of aimed to bring you on is that as I and some of my colleagues kind of grappled with this idea of structural racism and mental health practice, particularly thinking about our roles working with patients in teaching and training, we found ourselves feeling, well, goodness, we're stumbling through this. We're struggling. We don't feel prepared. We don't feel that our training, for all of its strengths, has necessarily given us what we need to try to approach and sort of meet this moment in the way that we would like to. And yet, upon just a little bit of brief exploration, again, my personal sense is likely just scratching the surface of what is available. We quickly found that there are an array of resources out there that could potentially meet that need and address what we were looking for as far as having the right tools to approach patients in the right way, having the right tools to teach our students and trainees in the right way. And so I and my colleagues found ourselves grappling with, well, what does that mean? It's interesting that we've had this great training. There are these resources out there that apparently were not part of our training, and we feel very unprepared as we're kind of trying to be the clinicians and educators that we want to be at this time and in this place. And so I would say with sort of what I might call the hypothesis, what I might call sort of the call to action that our group came to as we reflected on these issues was that the existence of the fact that these resources exist, just the few that we found, even on our initial exploration, to us, this really suggested that the lack of attention to racial identity and racism in our training was not really due to the absence of content, right? That resources were out there, and that perhaps instead it was due to our field lacking an intentional, sustained effort to both study and broadly integrate this content into our training and into our practice. That it's like that, it's not that there's nothing out there, it's just that for some reason this hasn't been giving perhaps the precedence, the study, the incorporation into what it means to be a mental health provider and be a psychiatrist that it should, in our group's humble opinion. And so with that in mind, I and my colleagues put forth I'd say our humble recommendations of what this could mean as far as what the challenge should be to our field, given this collective sense we were having of kind of not having what we need to meet this moment, despite the fact that there are resources out there that potentially could help us along the way. And what we came to is just, again, I couldn't say this is exhaustive. This was just our take on this that I have strongly felt as an individual provider and teacher as far as what we were looking for. And so the first recommendation we came to is thinking about the need for there to be broad institutional change in training and practice to really robustly address these issues. What I'll put forth for you from this article that we put together is that our feeling was how do you incentivize basically ensuring that issues of racism, issues of identity as it interfaces with mental illness, issues of how to address race and racism in psychiatric practice, how do we ensure that is foundationally part of mental health training, such that clinicians feel prepared to address these issues that inevitably are going to be in the room. And so we call upon, in this article, we call upon our institutions to really think about where are the areas where we have the sort of the things that keep us honest, the things that sort of dictate what folks need to and should learn. Things like if one is in residency training, the milestones that are set forth for trainees to try to meet. Thinking about things like continuing medical education requirements, requirements for licensure and certification. Our group humbly put forth that perhaps in some of those arenas where almost by requirement, providers and trainees are encouraged basically to learn about certain things in order to meet competence, there needs to be more of a lens towards these issues that so foundationally impact folks of minoritized identity. Our next recommendation was around the need for more implementation research. I will humbly say once again that I am certainly not an expert on the existing research literature in terms of interventions to address the interface of racism, racial identity, and mental health practice. But what we were finding as we were looking through what is available is that there are these excellent resources out there. Perhaps they haven't been given the rigorous study that other resources unrelated to race and racism have been given. Think about our foundational practices like cognitive behavioral therapy, the hundreds of randomized controlled trials and really intensive study to think about, does this work and how does it work and how do you apply it to this population and that population? And so our second recommendation or call was that the issue of racism and just racial identity as it relates to mental health and interventions to address these things like microaggressions coming from the patient, like the differences, an identity mismatch between provider and patient, that we need more research to really understand what are the best practices to address these sorts of things, and that it should be given the same importance as other sort of foundational competencies in mental health work that have been much more extensively studied. Our third call was for sustained resources. Our experience in a way was that, at least one of my experiences in 2020 was that a common response to this moment was to throw up, so let's have a one-time committee, or let's have a one-time sort of gathering or discussion about this. And so our call in this article was that we really would hope for our institutions, particularly our institutions of learning for psychiatric practice, our academic institutions, to give serious consideration to what it means to have sustained commitment to these issues. Things like funding and protected time for people who are working on issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, thinking about who is being brought in terms of research and practice to address these issues. And so our call to the institution of psychiatry was to really not let this be a flash in the pan of the moment, a trend, if you will, until we move on to the next issue, that this is here, this has been relevant, this will be relevant, and that it's important that there is sustained commitment in our institutions to understanding and addressing these problems. Next, we called for sort of a larger professional commitment from our national bodies. Again, this group of psychiatrists, and so we were thinking about things like our national organizations, our member organizations, the groups that sort of represent us. How do we look to those organizations to sort of set the tone as far as what is important? I'm thinking about examples of things you think about, like Healthy People 2020, when a national body or governmental agency sets a standard of this issue is important, and we have certain benchmarks that we're going to meet in 10 to 20 years to address this. That's something that can create accountability. And so our call was for our institutions within mental health to consider racism and racial identity as it interfaces with mental health practice in that same lens. How do we keep ourselves honest as far as thinking about what should be our goals for these issues? What should we be aiming for? Even if we fall short, how do we show that we are looking to keep ourselves accountable as an institution, as psychiatry as an institution, mental health as an institution? How do we make sure that we are being thoughtful about what it is that we are aiming for, and that we are working towards something concrete, whether it's eliminating disparities, whether it's establishing more standardized practices, whether it's some level of increased content in our educational materials, that there needs to be some form of sustained accountability and commitment. And then lastly, our last sort of point in this article, I would say really came, at least as we were putting together from my thinking of, we can call loudly for our institutions and our organizations and our larger bodies to be serious about these issues. Maybe they will be, maybe they won't. And so we felt that a critical piece as well is that each of us as individuals really maintains a personal commitment to be grappling with this interface. That our group as psychiatrists, as educators, I will say this is something that I think about often is continuing to sort of further my own education and personal journey as far as how do I understand the impact and influence of identity, of race, of racism in the work that I do? How do I continue to have a continuous process of educating myself about how to grapple with that interface, whether it's in my role as a provider serving patients in the community, whether it's in my role as a teacher, hoping to train folks to do this work, that I see it as a responsibility, and I think a responsibility that we should all carry to continue to build our understanding of these complex and nuanced issues. And so the personal responsibility, my feeling, our group's feeling, was certainly key as far as thinking about these issues. And so with that, I have a couple of more resources in my slides, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen and basically open it up to questions and comments.
Thank you, Dr. Talley, for a very thought-provoking presentation. We do have a few questions in the Q&A right now. If anyone else has any thoughts, any questions for Dr. Talley, if you could please put them in the Q&A section and I will do my best to get to them. Our first question is multi-layered, if you will. So I'll try to ask it to you in parts. Do you have any insights on the impact of historic and current racism on the willingness of BIPOC individuals in recovery to participate or attend follow-up outpatient mental health appointments?
Well, again, and I will say, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I was like, can't say enough that I am not the full expert on this literature, and I am still learning myself. And if there's one sort of thing that I would hope that audience members take away from this presentation is join me in the journey, continue to learn and to read. But absolutely, I will say that the research literature shows that whether it's initial sort of intake, if you will, or initial sort of engagement with mental health services, whether it's retention in services, sort of length of stay in treatment, that there are absolutely disparities by identity. And I think that while the root causes of that are complex and multifactorial, we think about things like the social determinants of health that disproportionately impact BIPOC individuals. I will say in my anecdotal practice, absolutely. I think these issues are key as far as engagement. In my clinical work, I work with a majority minority population, a majority BIPOC population. And I will say that just from things folks have explicitly told me about feeling othered, about feeling just uncomfortable, about feeling unwelcome in the clinical spaces where they are seen, that there is this hesitance to really feel that they are going to be heard. I'll say again, just speaking from my personal experience, I'll say it's very interesting walking into that space as a Black psychiatrist, which I will say I think I'm still, unfortunately, it's like there are only so many of us. We're very underrepresented in the psychiatric field. I found it's an amazing thing when some of my patients have met me for the first time and frankly are just shocked to see somebody who looks like them, and shocked in a positive way. But I think in my clinical experience, I think that while people of all identities can and should serve people of all identities, right? I think it's incumbent upon us as mental health practitioners to work to understand people of all backgrounds. I think that when you are of an identity where you have been systematically shut out of services, systematically shut out of opportunities in society, it is hard not to be cynical as far as are you really here to help me? Are you really going to be of service? Can I trust you enough to kind of share the things that are on my mind and my heart when what I'm seeing in this environment is not familiar? I don't see people who look like me. I'm not sure if I can connect. And so I absolutely think that sort of historical structural factors that have made the mental health system, not by definition, not always so welcome or outright exclusionary to BIPOC individuals, absolutely plays into folks feeling a hesitation to engage in the first place. So 100% in my anecdotal experience.
No, I totally agree with that. Thank you for that answer. The second part of that question, what experiences can you relate regarding systemic and structural racism for practitioners?
What can I relate? So what can I relate to, I guess, perhaps?
Perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say more than I care to relive, and more that there are many, that I found that on the one hand, I feel very lucky to have a lot of privileges in this world by virtue of my position. I've had the opportunity to have a wonderful education. I've had the opportunity to have a wonderful career in which in which I don't have some of the worries as far as safety and security that many out there have. However, I have absolutely had experience of being called a racial slur. I'll say a common one for me as far as microaggressions is people simply not assuming that I'm the doctor. People think I'm just about everybody else in the room, and that there is a great deal of surprise when it's like, oh, this is the person in charge. This is the physician. Now I'll share an example of being in an encounter where I was there with a resident, so a psychiatrist in training, and so basically the resident was observing me doing an interview with a patient in order to learn and to understand what was going on. And at the end of the encounter, the patient was turned to the resident who happened to be Caucasian, very clearly thought that he was the supervisor, and said, well, I really would like to hear from your boss, Dr. So-and-so. I could tell the resident was mortified. It was an awful feeling. It's this interesting feeling of no matter how all the privileges that can come, that race and racism is real, and that that you're not immune. So those are some of the examples that come to mind for me.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking a minute to answer that question, because I know sometimes these things can be a little hard to relive, if you will. And it kind of leads into this next couple of questions, which I have my own particular thoughts on, but it falls into sort of the realm of, experiencing these things in a professional setting, and how do you handle those things, right? So Melanie says that several years ago, she was in court, and a client called her a racial slur, and that she'll never forget it. She felt ill-equipped to respond, and still feel that way somewhat. Couldn't respond the way that they wanted, and now that it's happening, thinking that they're better prepared, would appreciate some advice. But she goes on to say, in another sort of a separate question, that currently she has a caseworker who works with her who is Caucasian, and they are working with a father who blurts out all sorts of racial slurs and regularly calls them the N-word. He has never met her, however, in person. So he's going off to the fact that, she's never been seen by him. And she's hesitant to reveal her race with this client, as clearly it's a trigger for him. And she would like some suggestions on how she might deal with that.
Sure. Well, I guess I first want to thank you, Melanie, for your bravery in sharing situations like this, and that I share in your pain of having been through things that are similar, and yet, of course, don't know what it was like for you in that moment to be in your shoes and experience that. And I'd say my first thought is I feel very strongly that when we are the target or the victim, if you will, when we are the person who experiences this, I think it's so important to not judge ourselves as far as our reaction in the moment. That I know a feeling that I have had when I've walked away from situations like this is another one's coming to my, like I said, I sadly go on for days, all sorts of them. This is not a clinical encounter, but I can remember about a year ago, I was just out and about at a restaurant, and a woman of a Caucasian background came up and said my hair was lovely and asked if she could touch it. And I told her, thank you for the compliment, but please don't. And she did it anyway. And I was so shocked that I couldn't even believe it was happening. And so I didn't say anything. Fortunately, I had friends who jumped in and said something, but I remember feeling there can be this mixed feeling when you didn't know what to say in the moment of like, should I have said something? What does it mean that I didn't say something? Did I not stand up for myself? And I know I have tried to really give myself grace and give myself space around the fact that it's like, it shouldn't be my burden to have to, educate other people or address or fix other people's biases, and that I have to allow myself the space for whatever reaction feels right to me in the moment. I may not feel safe to say something in the moment. I may have reasons to fear to stand up for myself in the moment. I may just not feel comfortable to stand up in the moment. And so to me, that one piece is key, that however one does react in the unexpected moment when something this ugly happens to us, I think I try not to judge myself. And I think none of us should judge ourselves, because it should not be our burden to have to, have the perfect way to do this. That being said, I will say something that I feel very strongly about, and we're in the service profession. I think this can get very complicated because whether we call them patients, consumers, clients, whatever your preferred term is for the folks that we are here to serve, it's their needs first. We're doing our best for them, and so I think there can be a feeling, at least I have had this feeling of, well, I have to subsume my comfort and my needs because I'm here to be of service for this person. But I will just say my personal take is that I've increasingly come up with the view that it's like, if I don't feel safety, and that's not just safety, sort of psychological safety to work with somebody, then it's like, it's not fair to me. And frankly, I probably can't even be of good service to them. And so I'm thinking about experiences where I've had an experience where a patient was using the N-word, actually not realizing that I was African-American. We were on the phone together. And I politely but respectfully addressed it directly and said, look, I need to ask that you not use that term with me, because that term is offensive to me. I will say that I know that may not always go perfectly. I think we can be in those really tough situations where if we're working with a person who is very ill or very much struggling, that it may not be the moment in that moment to address it. But I think it's critical to address these things head on, and that just because we are in a serving profession doesn't mean that we are not human beings and that we are not entitled to respect and to well-being and to safety. And then the last piece I'll add is that I'll say this connects to some of the work, some work that I do at the University of Pennsylvania. I've helped with a couple of colleagues there to create an initiative called Spaces of Color, where we basically provide confidential sort of processing dialogue spaces for folks who have experienced racism, who have experienced the trauma and the pain that comes from having a microaggression or a macroaggression thrown at you, being called a slur. Basically, we provide sort of a processing space to dialogue about those issues. And so I bring that example up just to say that I think it is so important to find your safe spaces, whether it's with your colleagues, whether it's with your friends, to share what happened with somebody, to not hold it in to yourself. Because I know that I have felt that I've had times where things happened and it's just like it's painful in the moment and it's horrible and you just want to move on, and just it's almost like did that even happen? I can't believe that happened. I don't even want to deal with it. But I think the pain doesn't go away, right? And I imagine anyone on this call who has ever experienced a microaggression, a macroaggression, racism in any form, knows and feels that it's like the scar doesn't go away just out of nowhere, that it's like the pain is still there. Particularly when it's unacknowledged. And so I think it's so important for us to find spaces, but I might say more importantly for our institutions to create, foster, and support spaces for those of us who experience these things to be able to dialogue, process, and heal from these issues. So I'll say that is my take. That again, Melanie, I feel for you that I've been through the same, and I find it's not easy to figure out what to do when these things happen.
Thank you for that answer. And I would like to highlight, the point where you said that you may not be of help to that person, right? Because I also think that there's the human part of that comes into it. Like you said, we are there to help people, but we still are humans, and we have feelings ourselves. So it may be one of those situations where you may have to remove yourself from actually working with that person and maybe find someone else who might be able to work with that person, because your feelings start to get in the way of what it is that you can do or will do to help that person. So it sucks that we have to deal with these things, but
if I could jump in and throw in just another thought related to
Sure.
that I felt this particularly in my work in the training environment. I've had trainees come to me with the question of, this patient or consumer that I work with is constantly using slurs, that, this patient is saying these offensive things. And that I found that particularly for the trainees I work with, when there's that extra vulnerable position of I'm in training, I'm here to learn, I'm supposed to push through difficult things in order to understand how to do my job, that the trainees I worked with expressed to me almost this guilt of, am I allowed to ask that this person work with somebody else? I'm supposed to do what I'm told, because I'm in school, I'm in residency, I'm supposed to be here, kind of carrying my weight. And so I've tried to really, as a supervisor, empower my trainees in saying, yes, you have the right to ask for that. That of course.
Get a glitch.
Yeah, I think she's froze there for a second.
As providers have to, I think I blinked out for a second.
Yeah, you did.
Oh, my. Well, I was just saying that I think we as providers need to be safe first. And I try to really share that and impart that to the folks I work with in training too.
Thank you. That's a great point. Nancy, you had a question? You're on mute.
Unmuted myself, sorry. I've been trying not to say anything because I feel like, I'm the white woman, I should keep my mouth shut. But I feel like I have something of use to say, of value to say, and that is when the worst of the Black Lives Matter riots were happening here in my neighborhood and at my front doorstep, and the fear of all that was happening, for whatever reason, it triggered in me the thought that, well, maybe you're not as educated as you think you are. And I made a commitment to read only books written by Black authors for 1 year. And Trevor Noah was my biggest, whoever he interviewed that was an author, I read that book. And I learned a lot. And I did know a pretty good amount going in, but I learned so much. And so I think this position that you take, that we should all be educating ourselves, is so important. But I just did something, and as much as I think I'm moving forward, I wonder how much I am, because someone suggested an author and I said her, and in response, well, it was Resmaa. I don't know why I thought it was a female name. I don't know why I said her, but for some part of me thought it was a her, and the woman said, no, it's a man. And so I don't know if that makes me structural bias or whatever that is, but there was nothing that was nasty about that in my intent, making the wrong assumption, other than we should never assume anything.
I'll jump in and say, Nancy, I appreciate your naming that as far as this experience. And I would see this as falling in the realm of our implicit biases, right? That even we can have these moments, and I look at implicit biases and microaggressions of having a similar vein of, there are many times when our intent is good. I won't say we're all well-intentioned. I'm sure there's folks not so much, but most of us are very well-intentioned in our interactions with others, not intending to hurt others when it comes to these particular sorts of issues. I can think of many colleagues, a key question that came up amongst some of my colleagues aiming to learn about these things as structural and systemic racism became sort of more of the national lexicon of, well, but I'm not racist. I don't hate anybody. I don't this, I don't that. But that it's like we all have the potential, based on our upbringing and experiences based on, I think, the spaces and institutions in which we live and breathe and work, to have a certain have unconscious perspectives about people who are different than us, that are wrong, and that when they are put out there are, although unintentionally, can offend and can hurt. And so I think it's so key to have that proactive energy to name it when it happens and to acknowledge it when it happens. That just because I didn't intend you to hurt you, I see and recognize that I have offended you and that I have misunderstood, and to apologize for the hurt that has been caused, even if it wasn't intended.
Thank you. Thank you.
Of course.
Totally agree. And this one has, I believe you touched on this a little bit also. This attendee would like to know where in the recommendations would psychiatry candidate recruitment and retention be included. So many med school psychiatry students and residents are driven out by racism in schools and training settings. At the same level, psychiatry teaching positions in schools and hospitals are few and far between for people with minoritized and targeted identities.
I was pulling up the questions to see you said that, and I will say, anonymous attendee, you said a word right there, absolutely. and I will say that speaks to, you know, this article that we put together. It was by no means exhaustive, I think, as far as the many important ways in which psychiatry as an institution needs to change. I think this is a huge issue that is definitely very personally resonant to me as somebody in the training environment, that I'll say my own personal journey, that it's so few faces that look like mine, so few faces, not only in my class in terms of my colleagues, but I'd say more importantly to that point about how the leaky pipeline means that the further and further we go up, there are fewer folks of minoritized identity, very few mentors, right? And I will say that I don't know that I don't have the right, I don't think I have a full solution to this issue, but to me, I would absolutely put this in the box of areas where our institution needs to set very specific, I think, benchmarks and goals to keep us accountable. Because the disparities go, I think you go all the way, of course, if you go way back in psychiatric training, that it begins with the long road of, we start with secondary education, we go to college, we go to med school, we go to residency, and that at each level we trickle out. I want to point out, sort of highlight a point that this commenter made, that amongst my colleagues, I don't have sort of the data on this, but I will say something that I have anecdotally heard about again and again. I think there has been importantly a rising tide around this issue, is the issue of folks who do make it into training, but are driven out because of discriminatory practices in terms of the educators that they are working with, unfairly being put on probation, unfairly being deemed as not meeting their marks or their milestones, not having sort of the right avenues for redress when that happens, and being in a very vulnerable position where, when you're in this training pathway, you don't have a lot of options if you leave your training, right? That if you're in a residency, it's increasingly hard. And of course, I'm speaking mainly for psychiatric training. It's become very competitive to get these slots. It's very hard to get a position. That if you are in a space where you are not being treated right, it's not simply a matter of like, oh, right, just find another job. That it's a very serious thing to step away from your training, and of course to be pushed out of your training. And so I think we need a very much more of an eye towards what are sort of what sort of metrics are we aiming for as far as what the makeup of the psychiatric workforce should look like. What are the sort of the intentional pipeline efforts, I think, starting way back, that institutions should think about. As I have the pleasure of sort of working on a fledgling pipeline effort for undergraduates at Penn, we've been partnering with our local HBCUs. It has to go back even further. We have to look back to high school and elementary school as far as who are the mentors that folks are seeing, but then also be thoughtful about how do we find ways to weed out the people, sort of the forces, whether it's the policies, whether it's the people who are in positions where even for those of minoritized identity who make it, they are being marginalized and they are being pushed out. So I thank that commenter for raising that important issue.
Yeah, that one, I thought it's like you said, it's very multifaceted. It's also nuanced too, because I think it's like you said, even going back to high school, elementary schools, who are the role models that we're seeing in these things, but I also think it's a cultural thing also, right? Because I just know growing up, this is a personal thing. Mental health wasn't really looked at as something that you would share. You know what I mean? I always remember seeing Black families who there was always the cousin or aunt who was always with grandma. And now looking back on it, I know that person had mental health issues, or they went undiagnosed because grandma never wanted to take them to be diagnosed for fear of misdiagnosis or whatever. So we just handled those things, and that person was taken care of, by grandma. And they always lived with grandma, and they always, had a job at the corner store or something like that. But they were never far from grandma. So I think it's also the cultural parts of that we look at, and looking at mental health is not a bad thing, or things that we can talk about without being looked down upon, if you will. So I think it's so nuanced in all of it. You know what I mean? You grow up wanting to be a lawyer or a doctor. Nobody grows up wanting to be a social worker or a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Those kind of things are never really talked about. So that's just my 2 cents.
I would just want to jump and say I so appreciate you framing that, and particularly I appreciate how you framed that. It's like, I think often when people talk about sort of the stigma and the cultural mistrust of BIPOC communities in relationship to mental health, it is sometimes talked about as though it's something inherent to these people and was something about our culture and who we are, when in reality, just as you frame, it's like part of where that comes from is that, grandma had the fear of bringing that family member to the healthcare system for fear of maltreatment, for fear of not getting the right sort of care. We know that healthcare as an institution, like all of our institutions in society, has a history of being overtly, explicitly racist. If we go, far back enough, currently even now to some extent. And so I'm really glad you framed that it's like people will sometimes look at this stigma and mistrust as, why is it that BIPOC communities can't adjust their thinking as far as the importance of mental well-being? But there is this key piece of how this has been done to us as communities, that it's like, this has been our experience of the system. And so therefore, how can you not feel a sense of hesitance, a sense of cynicism as far as engaging with care?
Exactly. Thank you. Can you comment on how mental health professionals can utilize 21st Century Cures Act requirement to allow participants to see the medical notes, i.e. open notes, and the impact on improving participant clinical communication?
That's an interesting question. I'll first, and I was like, I don't mean to sort of have all this, my sort of, the modesty of not an expert, that it's like, I don't know if this may be a little bit above my pay grade to answer, but what I will say is that, to me, open notes, and it's like, won't sit here and act like it's not scary. For those not familiar on the call, this is sort of having this legislation where consumers have access to the documentation from their visits, unless it's sort of dictated as being held back. But I will say, to me as a provider, I take it as, I think, an important and necessary challenge, that it's like that I need to be thoughtful about how I am talking about my patient or consumer, even in my writings, in terms of what am I thinking about in terms of explicitly naming what is going on. And I will say, of course, I know this is not a simple thing, that working in mental health, we have some nuances as far as aspects of our diagnoses that the person we're working with may not understand, may not have insight into, may become offended. And when they see that we are documenting something a certain way, I feel it really opens up an important opportunity to be thoughtful about what are you doing to be very clear and transparent in conveying to the person that you're working with, this is how I'm thinking about what is going on. And so I'll say, by and large, it's of course, I think it's a new and maybe perhaps a scary landscape for us as providers. I think it's important. And I would say, in my opinion, on balance, I think a good and necessary intervention to have some ability to have that sort of transparency. And I will say, thinking about this issue, our topic for today, to me, I do think it is a good avenue. To me, transparency can be a key part of sort of breaking down some of that, the cynicism, some of that feeling of hesitance to engage when you are from a marginalized group that has traditionally been shut out from or mistreated by traditional services. Having that transparency of this is what my provider is saying about me, I think can be a piece of trying to build that trust of understanding where a provider is coming from.
Thank you for that answer. Our next question is from an advocacy standpoint. What are some ways to get involved or better involved to address this structural racism?
Again, I'll say this is a big, broad one, and so
that
I may not have the full answer to this, but I will give my personal take of what I've tried to do in my professional life and career. I guess to me, my first thought on this is there's an element of narrowing it down to it starts in your own backyard, and what is your professional arena, what is your area of focus? Because structural racism as a concept, as this thing that pervades all institutions, I think that can be a very overwhelming thing when you're looking towards advocacy. It's like it's everywhere. It's that where does one begin as far as addressing these issues? But for instance, for me, I will say in terms of the inspiration for this article, working with my colleagues on it, a key piece of that inspiration came from, okay, structural racism, my goodness, overwhelming, intangible, so pervasive. Well, let's start with structural racism specifically as it relates to mental health practice. And what are some disparity issues that we think should be considered as far as where our field can be doing better in solving these problems? How should we be thinking about ways in which to ensure equity and inclusiveness are considered in the way in which we train and teach our residents? And so I think that to me, the first step is being sure to not to sort of think about one's own narrow lane in one's own backyard, if you will, because that's the arena that you may know best as far as where to begin. And then I might say that it might sort of depend on your role and your work as far as what the path is. I'll say an article like this one that inspired this talk, and of course it's in a journal that certainly not probably widely read necessarily by folks in the lay public. But I thought I thought this is in my mind a form of academic advocacy, that this sort of writing should be put forth in terms of how we're talking about these issues. I think about sort of understanding sort of your local policies as it relates to things like, and I'm thinking very local. I'll think about example from my thinking my own clinical work. I think things like thinking about no-show policies in a clinic, and how do you think about sort of closing people out from care? And are you considering sort of the structural factors that may be limiting a person's ability to engage? That I think sometimes when we think of advocacy, we think we think big, we think broad, we think politics, we think protest, and of course those are important key parts of advocacy. In my opinion, I think advocacy can be very small and local and have to do with how are you thinking about the institutions in which you work, the institutions in which you participate, and where are there areas in which there may be inequities and disparities that you could potentially first be making sure are coming to light and being identified, being thought about, being discussed. And then where are you in terms of being in the forefront of discussing, looking for, and offering solutions to those issues?
Thank you for that. Also, I saw as you were speaking, Bonnie put in the chat, if there's a specific racial justice interest that you have, there's a community organization in your area already working on that interest. And if there isn't, just in case you live in an area that, doesn't have anyone, the internet is a wonderful place sometimes. Google
sometimes being a key point, right?
Google what it is that interest is, and find an organization and ask them what they need to know, how you can help. Let them tell you what they need, and don't try to tell them what they need. And I think that is very sound advice. So thank you for your response, Dr. Talley, and thank you, Bonnie, for putting that in the chat. Michael, thank you for sharing your insight. Structural racism is anything but obvious. we go along with the construction projects and other personal experiences with the sense that they are that the underlying racism is invisible. Racism in the delivery service runs on both sides of the service, the delivery and the reception of the service offered. The educational approach structurally starts with the professionals, but how do we take that down to the person seeking treatment and the education they may need, but not welcome? Something of a dilemma, but speaks to the need of the societal approach, perhaps within the wider educational system.
And I will say, and I agree with how you have framed it, Michael, that it's like, I think it's a tough one to tackle one-on-one in the room. To me, one, because of that issue of almost the psychological safety of the provider. One of the examples that I didn't to read out loud from my slides, but as far as some of the vignettes that our group used in putting together this article was sort of the experience of a Black clinician being asked to almost provide a corrective experience for a racist white patient, and just how that is not an appropriate thing, in my opinion, to ask of a BIPOC provider as far as their safety. And so to me, this is tough, because I think one-on-one in the clinical space, when you've arrived at this spot where you are with this person who is not open to this understanding, that it is hard to kind of fold that, and perhaps not even your role to have to fold that educational mission in with the work that you are doing. And so I would agree that to me, this is a hard one to answer, and I think speaks to the broader educational efforts that maybe started far before that person came to the room, as far as how are we helping people at the earliest stages of life understand who they are, who the others are around them, and how to relate to them. So I think it's a tough one, and it speaks to kind of just how pernicious some of these issues are and how hard they are going to be to solve.
Thank you for that. Lindsay has a question. What are some changes you and your other colleagues have made in your clinical practices upon beginning this learning journey?
That's a great question, Lindsay. I love that. I will say, what for me as a provider, and I'd say I probably would first start maybe in my role as a teacher, that I have sort of tried to challenge myself as much as I know. There is a part of me that I will say that you feel that, as a BIPOC provider, it shouldn't be my responsibility solely to kind of be making changes in this realm, that I look to my colleagues of all backgrounds to be thoughtful about this. But I have definitely felt that a starting piece has been for me as a teacher to think about some of these resources that I've shared in this article, trying to find ways to propose of how do we incorporate this into our training. I mentioned that article about discussion of race and identity, that this is something that I aim to incorporate in my supervision. Ask my trainees, are you thinking about these questions in regards to the patient that you're working with, to the extent that you have your identity and their identity, and there's both how each of you experience yourselves, but then how you experience each other. Is there explicit discussion of that in this mental health sort of treatment space, where you are aiming to get to this very personal, deep, and connected level? And so I have definitely tried to find ways to, even though it's like my training, as excellent as it was, I think by virtue of psychiatric training as an institution, did not have everything that I might have wanted to have in this arena. I have tried to challenge myself around whether it's thinking about these structured ways to talk about microaggressions, whether it's thinking about how to discuss race and racism in supervision, to sort of incorporate that into my practice. And then I'll just reference another sort of initiative that I'm involved with through my role with the American Association for Community Psychiatry. I was very honored to be part of sort of the co-creation of an anti-racism quality improvement tool called the Self-Assessment for Modification of Anti-Racism tool, or the SMART tool, which we're basically aiming we basically created as a tool to sort of support community mental health providers in finding ways to start to identify, track, and ideally start to address disparities in the community mental health space. And so I'll say, for me, that's been over the past few years, my work of like, how do I think about this in my own backyard? And what is in the spaces that I'm at, where is structural racism relevant? And more importantly, what can I do as one person to change it? And so that's kind of how I have approached it in my work and career.
That's great. That is great. Thank you and that was a really good question, I think. I'm assuming that you have it, that you know of what it is Rashida is asking. Is spaces of color only open to University of Penn students?
Yes. So spaces of color, I'd mentioned a little bit earlier, is this basically these group confidential support spaces that I helped run with some of my colleagues. Yes, Rashida, unfortunately only available to folks at the University of Pennsylvania for now. I will say, as we've sort of built our fledgling effort, we certainly have aspirations to create and build something that could be, that could more widely be available outside of UPenn. But I'll say, in a sense, purely by bandwidth, it's myself and two or three other very dedicated co-facilitators who run those spaces, that unfortunately it is just for folks in the UPenn community right now. But I see you're about to go to just to add one more thing, Jamal, I will just say to that point, that effort, it really was, it was myself and some colleagues really in a similar vein of this, thinking of what do we do, coming together and thinking about, well, what can we offer? And my mindset was like, well, I am not the full expert on these issues, but I am a mental health provider. I know something about sort of dealing with trauma and holding space for people who've been through difficult things. I basically worked with I basically trained up a group of co-facilitators who don't have a traditional mental health background, but have lived experience as BIPOC employees with racism and its impacts. And so basically we just grassroots created this together, as far as feeling this is something that we need to hold space and create space in a structured way. And that it was just, our energy to think about it. And so I would encourage to folks in the audience, while, you want to be careful and thoughtful in creating these new sorts of things, that it's like, don't be afraid to think about how do I create this for myself in my space? And how do I then argue for the need to have these spaces be supported and be structured in my institution?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think sometimes we and which is a natural thing. We're looking for spaces to belong sometimes, and it's nice when there's already a space that's created that we can go to and sort of just slide right in. But if there isn't a space that is accessible to you for whatever reasons, I think, if it's important and you feel like that is something that should be, then think about how you might want to create it, or what would be needed in that space. I think sometimes we don't feel like we can do those things, but I think, just as you've proved, like, those things can be done. It's just a matter of thinking about what is needed and putting it out there. So if you build it, they will come, if you will. I think we are getting close to time, so I think this is going to be our last question. We are called a team, but we are never included on important information that comes from our office. Typically, we learn about what is going to happen in our office from other people. If someone calls our office, the person that picks up the phone can't answer a question about information that was shared by the office. The leaders loosely call us a team, but outsiders think our office is dysfunctional. It is draining to work there, especially having the feeling of being less than. How do you bring it up if no one else does, and then be told it sounds like a you problem?
Right. This is a complicated issue, and I think I would say this experience that this person has brought up, it speaks to an experience that I think that many people in general go through, but that I think BIPOC individuals in particular, folks of minoritized identity, disproportionately go through that experience of I am not valued. I am not thought of. I'm told I'm the team member in name, but in reality, I am not supported. And I will say, to me, what's tough about this is that I think that at least my experience has been, it is hard, as it's like, it shouldn't be the responsible of the individual to have to tackle this, right? That it's like, part of what is hard about this is that we as individuals can feel vulnerable and disempowered in trying to deal with an issue like this? Am I going to be fired? Am I going to be, am I getting in trouble with my supervisors? Is this what's going to happen? And so I don't know if this is the most helpful answer, because in my mind, I think it is an issue institutionally that we do not have more backstops within, say, human resources, within our sort of our avenues for redress when we are being discriminated against, that we don't really have, I think, enough solid structures around being able to confidentially report those things and have them addressed, whether it's things like an ombudsman or somebody where we can confidentially share, I am not being treated right without fear of recrimination. And so I guess the best I can say is that I feel for the person sharing this, because I think why we can feel so vulnerable in a position like this person has described is that often we don't have that protection of what we can do when we are being treated unfairly. I think it speaks to how, while we can, try to navigate as best we can, I think about advice I've been given of when I'm being mistreated, of making sure to, save emails if it's there, document things, keeping a diary to oneself of what is happening on which day, looking for that trusted ally within your organizational space. I think experiences like that, many people don't have avenues to really address an experience like this on an institutional level. And I think it speaks to how we really need to challenge our institutions to be thoughtful about what beyond sort of just blandly talking about mistreatment and things like that, do we have things specific to when you're being targeted based on your identity and what the redress is? So I appreciate the point being raised.
Thank you for that answer. I appreciate that. And thank you for the wonderful presentation. And I will toss it over to Nancy to close for us.
Yes, I'm a little bit speechless, which doesn't happen very often.
At all.
My goodness.
Yes. Let me just say this one thing. Let me get the housekeeping out of the way. As we all know, February is Black History Month. Our next presentation is Make One's Way in the World with Dr. Ilya Davis, a professor of philosophy at Morehouse College. And it will be Thursday, February 23rd from noon to 1:30. We're starting at noon because he's going to have a class with us on this webinar who are freshmen, and will speak to some of the issues related to the youth and young adults that we want to see discussed as it relates to our grant. I also want to say, and I mean this sincerely, that this was an extraordinary webinar for me. And as some people may have noticed, I am uncomfortable. I've had my own experiences in the past that are racist, but because I'm white in a room full of Black women, and that I don't want to be that person who thinks that I know what they need, that I want to hear what they have to say. And I think I learned that probably the hard way a long time ago. And I'm grateful to be here today and to be a part of this conversation, even if it's just because I did all the legwork, and to know that the conversation is happening and that people can feel this comfortable opening themselves up and being honest in a public place. And that there's a Dr. Rachel Talley in the world, and that she's not the only one. There are going to be others out there too, who are bringing this incredible education and the emotions and lived experience that we all need to hear. And I am very grateful and honored that you were with us today, Dr. Talley.
Well, I just want to say, I really appreciate your warm words, and that I am so flattered and honored to have been here, to be at this presentation. And I want to thank those on the call for your attention and your questions. And that if I were to share one parting word, again, I hope that this was helpful as far as just sharing my learning journey, that I'm frankly, at the end of the day, just an individual trying to navigate these waters. I hope, like everybody else on this call, and that I hope that all of us on the call kind of continue that motivation to try to grapple with and understand and deal with what I think are very painful, challenging issues. And so just really appreciate everybody's interest and attention in joining today.
Thank you, Dr. Talley. Jamal, last word.
It was just, I always find these conversations to be eye-opening, and it was a very eye-opening conversation, and I thank you for delving into it with us, Dr. Talley. Especially, I especially like that you kept saying that you're not the expert. Because
I don't know who is that.
right,
Point me
that's
to them
exactly
if you
my
find
point.
them.
That is exactly my point. So that was it. I think it gives a bit of comfort in that we can have this discussion and not being thought to be right or wrong in anything that one says. So thank you for that.
You're most welcome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.